Near midnight, Elias Carter, a single father and former firefighter, heard frantic knocking through the fierce Oregon rain. He opened the door, and a young woman in a soaked designer dress collapsed into his arms, crying, trembling, barefoot, and bleeding. She introduced herself as Seraphina Ward. "Heirs to the Ward Empire," she whispered. "They'll kill me. Please don't call the police." That night, as the storm held around them, Elias had no idea a billion-dollar conspiracy and two broken hearts were about to be saved. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forest floor into a maze of mud and rushing streams. Thunder rolled across the mountains, shaking the windows of the small wooden cabin that sat alone at the edge of Oregon's wilderness. Inside, a single lamp cast warm golden light across rough Hune walls and handmade furniture. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. Elias Carter sat at his workbench near the window, sanding a piece of maple wood with calloused, careful hands. He was 36 years old, with the kind of weathered face that comes from too many sleepless nights and too many memories that refuse to fade. His dark hair was flecked with premature gray, his shoulders broad but hunched slightly forward as if carrying an invisible weight, and he was the weight of guilt, the weight of survival. 5 years ago, Elias had been one of the city's best firefighters. His crew had trusted him with their lives. But on a Tuesday night in October, everything changed. They'd responded to a warehouse fire, flames pouring through the roof, smoke so thick it turned day into midnight. His wife, CLA, had been working late at her office 3 blocks away. She'd heard the sirens and come to watch, worried for him like she always was. But the building had chemicals stored illegally in the basement. When the explosion came, it ripped through the structure like the hand of an angry god. Elias survived because he'd been near the exit. Clara died because she'd been standing too close, trying to see if he was safe. He'd been the one to carry her body out of the rubble. He'd held her hand as the paramedics checked for a pulse they would never find. In the months that followed, the nightmares came every night. The sound of her voice calling his name. The smell of smoke that never seemed to wash out of his skin. The department offered him counseling, time off, anything he needed. But what he needed was to disappear. 3 months after the funeral, he resigned. He sold their house in the city, packed what little he wanted to keep, and moved to this cabin deep in the Oregon forest with his daughter Audrey. Here there were no sirens, no burning buildings, no memories on every corner. Here, he could make furniture with his hands and pretend that quiet work could silence the ghosts. Upstairs in the loft, his daughter, Audrey, slept beneath a patchwork quilt her grandmother had made. She was 8 years old with dark curls that fell across the pillow and her mother's gentle features. On the nightstand beside her bed sat a small analog camera, a clunky old thing with actual film that her grandmother had given her for her 7th birthday. Audrey loved that camera more than any toy. She used it to capture everything. The way morning light fell through the pine needles, a robin building its nest in the eaves. Her father's scarred hands, shaping wood into something beautiful. She had a gift for seeing moments that mattered. Every Sunday morning, Audrey wrote letters to her mother in heaven. She'd sit at the kitchen table with colored pencils and lined paper, her tongue poking out in concentration, and she'd tell Clara about her week, about the deer she'd seen at the edge of the clearing, about the story her dad had read to her at bedtime, about how much she missed her. Then she'd fold each letter into a paper airplane and launch it from the porch, watching it sail into the sky until it disappeared among the trees. Elias never told her to stop. He understood that some conversations can't be ended. Just because someone is gone, the cabin itself was small but sturdy, built by Elias's own hands over the course of 2 summers. One large room served as kitchen, workspace, and living area. A ladder led up to the loft where Audrey slept. Everything was simple, functional, honest. There were no marble floors or crystal chandeliers, just wood and warmth and the kind of peace that comes from being far away from the noise of the world. It was the opposite of everything Seraphina Ward had ever known. 300 to the south in the heart of the city, the Ward estate rose like a glass monument to wealth and power. The mansion sprawled across 5 acres. All cold marble and floor to ceiling windows that reflected the skyline, but never seemed to let in warmth. Inside, rooms echoed with emptiness. Despite being filled with priceless art and furniture that cost more than most people's homes, this was where Seraphina Ward had spent her entire life, and she had never once felt at home. She stood now in her bedroom on the 3rd floor, staring out at the city lights below. She wore a designer red dress, the kind that appeared in fashion magazines, and her blonde hair fell in carefully styled waves past her shoulders. To anyone looking at her, she was the picture of privilege and grace. But Seraphina had learned a brutal truth early in life. Wealth could be the most beautiful prison ever built. Her mother had died when Seraphina was 12, a sudden illness that took her in less than a month. Her father, devastated and lonely, had remarried within a year to a man named Richard Hale. Richard was handsome, charming, impeccably dressed, and always knew exactly what to say in social situations. He'd courted Seraphina's father with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his entire life learning to read people's weaknesses and exploit them. Within 6 months of the wedding, Richard had maneuvered himself into a position on the board of Ward Global. Within 3 years, he was chief financial officer. And now, with Seraphina's father dead from a sudden heart attack 6 months ago, Richard sat as interim chairman, one signature away from permanent control. The only obstacle was Seraphina herself. As the sole heir, she held the controlling shares of Ward Global. Her father's will had been explicit. Upon his death, Seraphina would inherit everything, provided she was deemed legally competent to manage the estate. It was a standard clause meant to protect against the possibility of dementia or incapacity. Richard had found his loophole. Richard Hale was 55 years old, with silver hair, perfectly combed and suits tailored to hide the softness of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. He smiled easily, especially at board meetings and charity galas. But those who knew him well understood that his eyes never matched his smile. They were cold, calculating the eyes of a man who saw people as assets to be leveraged or obstacles to be removed. Beside him in this conspiracy stood Constance Whitlock, the family's lawyer and Richard's most trusted ally. She was 42, sharp-featured with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of skepticism. Constance had the kind of intelligence that cuts like a scalpel, and she'd spent her career finding the gray areas in the law, where terrible things could be made to look perfectly legal. Together, she and Richard had crafted a plan so elegant in its cruelty that it might have been admirable if it weren't so monstrous. The strategy was simple. They would have Seraphina declared mentally incompetent through an emergency medical guardianship order. All they needed was documentation of erratic behavior, testimony from a carefully selected psychiatrist who owed Richard favors, and a sympathetic judge. Once the order was signed, Seraphina would be placed in a private psychiatric facility for evaluation. During that time, her shares would be transferred to a temporary conservator, namely Richard in temporary. In legal terms, could last years long enough for Richard to consolidate power, restructure the company, and ensure that even if Seraphina ever regained control, there would be nothing left worth controlling. They'd been laying the groundwork for months, whispering to board members that Seraphina seemed unstable, emotional, unfit for the pressures of leadership, scheduling meetings, and then claiming she'd missed them, circulating carefully edited emails that made her sound paranoid. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, and it was working. But Seraphina was smarter than they'd given her credit for. She'd seen the trap forming around her, and she'd been preparing. The third piece of their machinery was Clinton Briggs. He was 40 years old, former military, discharged under circumstances. He never discussed he had the build of someone who had spent years training for violence. Broad shoulders, thick neck, hands that looked like they could break bone without much effort. He wore dark suits that didn't quite hide the bulge of the firearm he carried beneath his jacket. His job was security. Officially, unofficially, he was the man Richard called when something needed to disappear. Clinton drove a black SUV with tinted windows and a modified engine. He didn't ask questions, didn't express opinions. He received instructions and executed them with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped thinking of his targets as human beings. Seraphina was just another job, a problem to be contained. But Seraphina Ward was not the naive eyes they believed her to be. For the past 4 months, she'd been gathering evidence. She'd installed recording software on her phone and computer. She'd copied financial records from the company's servers, tracing transactions through layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts. She'd attended meetings with Richard and Constance where they thought she wasn't paying attention when in fact her phone was recording every word from her purse. The USB drive labeled Ward Trust contained everything audio files of Richard and Constance discussing the guardianship plan in explicit detail. Spreadsheets showing money being laundered through dummy trust accounts. Email chains proving Richard had been systematically looting the company's pension fund. Bank records showing bribes paid to the county's chief prosecutor and 2 local judges. It was enough to destroy Richard completely. And Seraphina knew it. She also knew that if Richard discovered what she had, he wouldn't just try to have her declared incompetent. He would make sure she disappeared permanently. She'd sewn the USB drive into the lining of her favorite red dress, the one with the hidden pocket at the hip. She'd memorized the contact information for George Henry, an independent journalist who'd been blacklisted by major outlets for refusing to kill a corruption story that implicated several powerful politicians. He lived on freelance work now, publishing investigations on his own platform. But he had a reputation for integrity that couldn't be bought. If Seraphina could get the evidence to him, he would know what to do with it. The plan had been simple. Wait until Richard was out of town for a board meeting in New York, slip out of the estate, and drive to George's office in the neighboring state. But Richard had gotten suspicious. He assigned Clinton to watch her, ostensibly for her safety, but really to make sure she didn't run. 2 days ago, Constance had arrived at the mansion with papers for Seraphina to sign. Documents she claimed were routine financial updates. Seraphina had reviewed them carefully and realized they were consent forms for psychiatric evaluation. She'd refused to sign. That's when she knew she was out of time. The night of the storm, Clinton had been outside her bedroom door pacing. Seraphina had waited until 2 o'clock in the morning, then climbed out her bathroom window onto the second-floor balcony. She'd shimmy down the trellis, praying the rain slicked wouldn't give way, and ran to the garage where she kept her car. She didn't take luggage, didn't take anything except her phone, the dress she was wearing, and the USB drive hidden within it. She made it 20 a.m. before she saw the headlights in her rear-view mirror. Clinton's black SUV gaining fast. She'd floored the accelerator, her hands shaking on the wheel, but the SUV was faster. He pulled alongside her on the empty highway, his window rolling down. She'd swerved onto a logging road at the last second, the car fishtailing on the wet gravel, and plunged into the forest. The road had narrowed to a trail, then disappeared entirely into mud and fallen branches. Her car had gotten stuck in a ditch. She had abandoned it and run. The cabin represented everything. Seraphina's world was not, where her mansion was cold marble and echoing halls. Elias's home radiated golden light and the smell of woodsome smoke, where vases cost more than cars. Here, a jar of wildflowers sat on a windowsill. The contrast was a language Seraphina had forgotten existed. That night, the storm came fast. Seraphina had fled the estate in the early evening, taking only her phone, the USB drive sewn into the lining of her dress, and the clothes on her back. Clinton's SUV had pursued her down the coastal highway. She'd veered onto a logging road, her car skidding in the mud before she abandoned it and ran into the trees, barefoot, branches tearing her dress. Rain turning the forest floor into a river of cold. She'd seen the cabin's light through the pines and stumbled toward it like a drowning woman reaching for shore. 3 sharp knocks. Elias set down his sandpaper and grabbed a flashlight. He opened the door. Seraphina fell forward, gasping. Her feet were cut and muddy, her dress clinging to her skin, her mascara streaked down her face. He caught her before she hit the floor. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "No police." Elias pulled her inside and locked the door. He didn't ask questions yet. He grabbed a wool blanket from the couch, wrapped it around her shoulders, and guided her to a chair by the wood stove. He filled a kettle and set it on the heat. From a cabinet, he pulled out a first aid kit. "Who's chasing you?" he asked quietly. Seraphina shook her head, her breath coming in shudders. "People who can afford to pay everyone in this county." Elias knelt and examined her feet. Cuts, bruises, dirt embedded in the skin. He cleaned them with antiseptic, his hands steady. He'd done this before, 1,000 times in burning buildings and ambulance bays. He didn't press her for details. Not yet. As he worked, a small plastic-wrapped package slipped from the hem of her dress and landed on the floor. Seraphina's eyes went wide. Elias picked it up, a USB drive in a waterproof pouch labeled in neat handwriting. "War Trust." He handed it to her without looking at it. "Yours." She took it, her hands trembling. "Thank you." He glanced toward the loft where Audrey slept. The storm was getting worse. Phone lines were already crackling with static. Even if he wanted to call for help, the service was unreliable out here in bad weather. And something in Seraphina's eyes told him that calling anyone might be the worst thing he could do. "You can stay tonight," Elias said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Seraphina looked at him, and for the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Safety. The storm raged through the night, wind howling through the pines, Zen lashing the windows. Elias gave Seraphina a dry shirt and sweatpants. She changed in the small bathroom, catching sight of herself in the mirror. Bruises on her wrists where Clinton had grabbed her the day before. Scratches across her collarbone. She looked like a stranger to herself when she emerged. Elias had made tea. He handed her a mug and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. Audrey was still asleep upstairs, her breathing soft and even. "My name is Seraphina Ward," she said quietly. "You've probably heard of Ward Global." Elias nodded. "Everyone had Financial Empire billions in assets. My stepfather wants to take the company from me. He's been planning it for months. I found evidence, recordings, financial records, proof of illegal activity. If I'd gone to the police in the city, they would have called him first. He owns too many people that what's on a USB?" Elias asked. "Everything," Seraphina said. "Money laundering through trust accounts. Recordings of him and his lawyer discussing how to have me declared incompetent. They were going to lock me in a psychiatric facility, claim I was a danger to myself. Then they'd take control of my shares." Elias sat back processing. "You need to get that evidence to someone who can't be bought." Seraphina nodded. "There's a journalist, George Henry. He's independent. Used to work for a major outlet until he exposed a corruption case that got him blacklisted. He lives off freelance work now, but he has integrity. If I can get this to him, he'll know what to do with it." "Why did you come here?" Elias asked. Seraphina looked around the cabin at the worn furniture, the handmade shelves, the drawing Audrey had taped to the wall of a girl holding her father's hand, "because no one would think to look for me in a place like this." Elias considered her words. "They'll come looking. I know. And if they find you here, they'll find my daughter." Seraphina's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "That's not what I'm saying," Elias interrupted. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "I'm saying we need a plan because no one deserves to die alone out there in the cold, and I'm not letting anyone hurt my kid." Seraphina met his eyes. In that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. A man who meant what he said. Morning came slowly, the storm easing to a drizzle. Audrey climbed down from the loft, rubbing her eyes. She saw Seraphina sitting at the table and froze. "Audrey, this is Seraphina," Elias said gently. "She needed a place to stay last night. She's a friend." Audrey studied Seraphina with the unfiltered curiosity of a child. "You have pretty hair." Seraphina smiled despite everything. "Thank you." Audrey picked a handful of wildflowers from the jar on the counter and handed them to Seraphina. "These are for you. Dad says flowers help when you're sad." Seraphina took them, her eyes glistening. "I haven't felt this normal in years." Elias made breakfast. Simple and warm. Scrambled eggs. Dust. Black coffee. They ate quietly, the tension of the night softening in the daylight. But Elias knew it wouldn't last. "Why did you help me?" Seraphina asked when Audrey went outside to play. Elias stared into his coffee. Because I know what it's like to lose someone and feel powerless. After my wife died, I spent months wishing I'd been faster, smarter, braver. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help you. Seraphina's voice was barely a whisper. At home, I had everything except freedom. Elios Mataza. Freedom is just a place where someone believes you. Those words settled between them like a promise. They made a plan. Elias knew of an old church about 20 miles north, abandoned except for the caretaker who checked on it twice a month. The church had a satellite phone, a relic from when it served as a rural community hub. If they could get there, they could contact George Henry. But first, they had to move. Elias gathered supplies. Bottled water, a first kit, a flashlight, a flare gun. Seraphina tucked the USB drive back in her pocket. Audrey grabbed her analog camera, always ready to document the world. They were about to leave when headlights cut through the trees. Ellis doused the lamp. He moved to the window and peered through the curtain that a black SUV idled at the edge of the clearing. Clinton Briggs stepped out, followed by two other men. Upstairs, Elias whispered, "Both of you." "Now." Seraphina grabbed Audrey's hand and pulled her toward the loft. Elias opened the trapdoor to the crawl space beneath, a storage area for firewood. It was small, but it had ventilation. "Get in. Stay quiet." The women climbed down. Elias closed the hatch and covered it with a rug. A heavy knock on the door. Elias opened it, his face neutral. "Help you?" he asked. Clinton held up a photo on his phone. Seraphina's face. "Looking for this woman, saying her?" Elias shook his head. "No one's been through here." Clinton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I do." Actually, Clinton's hand moved toward his jacket. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Elias stepped back, hands raised. "Fine. Look." The men entered, spreading through the cabin. One checked the loft, another the kitchen. Elias's mind raced. He needed a distraction. He glanced at the wood stove, still smoldering. An idea formed. Dangerous, but possible. He moved toward the kitchen, casually reaching for a pot. Inside, he'd stored oily rags he used for finishing wood. He tossed them onto the stove. Thick smoke billowed instantly, filling the cabin. "Fire!" Elias shouted. The men coughed, stumbling toward the door. Clinton cursed, retreating outside. In the chaos, Elias opened the back window, hauled open the trapdoor, and pulled Seraphina and Audrey out. They ran through the smoke and out the back into the trees. Behind them, Clinton realized the trick too late. He shouted orders, his men fanning into the forest. Elias led them along a narrow trail. He knew by heart. The path slick with rain. Seraphina's bare feet slipped on the mud. Elias stopped, pulled her onto his back. "Hold on." Audrey ran ahead, her small legs moving fast. They reached a stream, swollen with rainwater, and waded through the cold biting at their skin. The sound of pursuit faded. They kept moving. They found shelter in an abandoned storage shed near an old logging road. Elias sat Seraphina down gently. Her feet were bleeding again. He wrapped them with strips torn from his shirt. Audrey sat beside Seraphina, shivering. Seraphina pulled her close, sharing warmth. "You're very brave," she whispered to the girl. "So are you," Audrey said simply. Elias built a small fire in a rusted barrel outside, the shed using dry wood from inside. The smoke was minimal, dispersed by the trees. They huddled around it, the flames casting shadows on their faces. "Why are you doing this?" Seraphina asked Elias. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "You don't know me. I know enough." Seraphina looked at the fire. "I spent my whole life surrounded by people, and I've never felt more alone. Until now." Elias didn't respond, but something in his chest loosened. He hadn't let anyone close since his wife died. Trusting again felt like reopening a wound. But Seraphina wasn't asking for his heart. She was asking for his help and that he could give. They stayed in the shed until dawn. Audrey fell asleep against Seraphina's shoulder. Seraphina stroked the girl's hair, feeling a tenderness she hadn't known she was capable of. Elias watched them, the firelight flickering. He thought of his wife, of the promise he'd made at her grave, to protect Audrey, to never let her feel alone. Maybe protecting Seraphina was part of that promise, too. The next morning, they set out for the church. The journey took hours, winding through back roads and forest trails. By midday, they reached it, a small white building with peeling paint and a crooked steeple. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust. The pews were covered in sheets. Elias found the satellite phone in the back office, exactly where he remembered. He handed it to Seraphina. She dialed George Henry's number, her hand shaking. It rang twice. "Hello." A man's voice. Cautious. "Mr. Henry, my name is Seraphina Ward. I have evidence of corporate fraud and conspiracy. I need your help." There was a pause. "How did you get this number?" "A mutual contact. I'm sending you a file via encrypted email. It contains financial records and audio recordings. If you verify it, you'll understand." "Where are you?" "Say for now, Miss Ward. If what you're saying is true, you're in serious danger. You need federal protection. I need you to publish the truth. That's the only protection that matters." George sighed. "Send me the file. I'll verify it. If it checks out, I'll contact a federal agent I trust. But you need to be prepared for what comes next." Seraphina looked at Elias, then at Audrey, who was photographing the stained glass windows with her camera. "I'm ready." She accessed the USB drive using the church's old computer, uploading the files to an encrypted server. George provided. She sent check sums to verify the data integrity, ensuring no one could claim the recordings were fabricated. George called back an hour later. "This is explosive. I've contacted Agent William Zane, FBI. He specializes in white-collar crime and operates independently. He'll need you to testify, but with this evidence, he can move fast." "How fast?" Seraphina asked. 24 hours, maybe less. But you need to stay hidden until then. If Richard or his people get to you first, none of this matters." Seraphina agreed. They ended the call. She turned to Elias. "We've set everything in motion. Now we just have to survive." But survival was about to get harder. Back at the Ward estate, Richard Hale sat in his office, a crystal glass of whiskey in hand. Constance Whitlock stood by the window, her arms crossed. "She's out there with evidence," Constance said. "If it reaches the wrong people." "It won't," Richard interrupted. "Clinton is handling it. Clinton lost her once already." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then he'll find her again. And this time there won't be any mistakes." Constance pulled out her phone, scrolling through a prepared statement. "I've drafted a press release. Seraphina Ward, suffering from severe mental distress, has fled a private treatment facility. Family requests privacy during this difficult time that we control the narrative." Richard smiled. "Good. Make her look unstable. By the time anyone listens to her, no one will believe a word she says." The news broke that evening. Every local station ran the story. Aries missing. Family concerned. Possible mental health crisis. Seraphina's face appeared on screens across the state. Framed as a tragedy, not a conspiracy. Elias saw it on the television at a gas station where they'd stopped for supplies. His stomach sank. "They're painting you as the villain," he said. Seraphina stared at the screen. Her jaw clenched. "They're very good at that." Clinton was closing in. He traced Seraphina's abandoned car, interviewed locals, pieced together her direction. By nightfall, he and his team were sweeping the forest roads, checking every structure. Elias, Seraphina, and Audrey took shelter in an old salt storage depot on the edge of town, a crumbling building used decades ago for winter road maintenance. It was cold, drafty, but hidden. Seraphina sat against the wall, exhausted. Audrey sat beside her, sketching in a notebook. She handed Seraphina the drawing. Two women holding hands, standing under a tree. "That's you and me," Audrey said. "You're my friend now." Seraphina's eyes welled. She pulled Audrey into a hug. "I've never had a friend like you." Elias stood by the window, watching the road. The storm was picking up again. Snow beginning to mix with the rain, that a blizzard was coming. That night, the storm hit with full force. Wind screamed through the cracks in the depot walls. Snow piled against the doors. Elias rationed the supplies, knowing they might be stuck for days. Seraphina sat beside the small camping stove they brought, trying to keep warm. "I keep thinking about what you said," she murmured, "about freedom being a place where someone believes you. I've spent my whole life in a mansion, and I never felt free. But here in this freezing shed with you and Audrey, I feel more alive than I have in years." Elias looked at her. "That's because you're fighting for something now, not just surviving." "Fighting?" Seraphina nodded. "I want to testify. I want to stand in front of a judge and tell the truth. Even if it costs me everything, it won't cost you everything." Elias said, "You'll still have yourself, and that's more than Richard ever had." A sound outside, boots crunching in the snow. Elias grabbed a flare gun. "Stay here." He slipped outside. Two figures moved through the blizzard, flashlights cutting through the white. Clinton and one of his men. Elias fired the flare gun into the air. A bright red streak against the storm. It was a distraction, a signal. He ran in the opposite direction, drawing them away from the depot. Clinton gave chase. Elias knew the terrain, but the snow was disorienting. He stumbled. Fell. Clinton was on him in seconds. "Where is she?" Clinton demanded. His gun drawn. "Gone." Elias lit. Clinton raised the gun. Last chance. A shot rang out, but not from Clinton's weapon. He collapsed, clutching his leg. Agent William Zane emerged from the snow. A team of federal agents behind him. Clinton breaks. "You're under arrest," Zane said. Elias stood shaking. "How did you?" "George Henry sent us your location," Zane said. "We've been tracking Richard Hale for months. Miss Ward's evidence gave us everything we needed." "Where is she?" Elias led them back to the depot. Seraphina and Audrey were safe inside. When Seraphina saw the agents, she exhaled for the first time in days. "It's over," Zane said. "We've already arrested Richard Hale and Constance Whitlock. Your testimony will seal the case." But it wasn't over yet. Clinton, wounded but desperate, had one card left to play. As agents secured him, he broke free, tackling the nearest agent and grabbing his gun. He ran toward the depot. Inside, Audrey screamed. Clinton burst through the door, his weapon aimed at her. "Nobody move." He snarled, pulling Audrey in front of him as a shield. Elias stepped forward, hands raised. "Let her go." "Back off," Clinton said. Elias's voice was calm, steady. It was the voice he'd used 1,000 times in burning buildings, talking people down from ledges, convincing them to trust him. "You're hurt. You're scared. I get it. But she's just a kid. She's not part of this. She's leverage." "She's my daughter," I said. His voice cracked raw and honest. "And you're threatening the only thing I have left in this world. Let her go and we'll talk. Just you and me." Clinton hesitated. Elias took a step closer. "I know what it's like to lose everything." Elias continued. "I lost my wife. I almost lost myself, but hurting a child won't fix what's broken. It'll just make it worse." For a moment, Clinton's grip loosened. Audrey twisted free, running to Seraphina. Agents swarmed Clinton, disarming him. Elias fell to his knees, pulling Audrey into his arms. "You're okay. You're okay." Seraphina knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face. The three of them held each other as the storm raged outside. Days later, Seraphina sat in a hospital room, her feet bandaged, her body finally resting. Elias and Audrey sat on either side of her bed. On the television, the news played. Richard Hale and Constance Whitlock in handcuffs led into a federal courthouse. The anchor reported on the scandal, money laundering, conspiracy, attempted guardianship fraud. George Henry's article had gone viral, detailing the corruption, the chase, the rescue. Seraphina Ward was no longer the unstable Heiress. She was the whistleblower who brought down an empire. Audrey handed Seraphina a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter like the ones I write to my mom, but this one's for you." Seraphina opened it in crayon. Audrey had written, "You're part of our family now." Seraphina pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did." Elias said, "You trusted us, and sometimes that's all it takes." 1 year later, the Ward estate had been sold. Seraphina stood on a stage at the grand opening of the Ward Trust Fund, an organization dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse and corporate manipulation. She spoke into the microphone, her voice strong. "I used to live in a mansion, but I was small in my own life. In a tiny cabin in the woods, I learned what it means to be free. Freedom isn't a place. It's the people who believe in you when no one else does." The audience applauded. In the front row sat Elias and Audrey, both smiling. After the ceremony, they walked together along a lake path, golden sunlight filtering through the trees. Audrey ran ahead, flying a kite she'd made herself. Seraphina took Elias's hand. "That door you opened that night, it opened my entire life." Elias squeezed her hand gently. "You knocked with courage. That's what made the difference." They stood together, watching Audrey laugh as the kite soared higher. For the first time in years, they all felt something rare and precious. Home. Sometimes saving a stranger is how you save.